Hey everybody. Hope you all are doing well. Hope you all are having a good week. We are going to be today talking about environment exposure and health disparity. So how the impacts of the environment and where we live and how we live in our environments, how our environments actually impact our health outcomes. And of course, how that leads to health disparities in our community across these different environmental and exposure related things that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to be talking about, environmental determinants of health and their impact on health disparities and on exposure and all those sorts of things. So be thinking about as a through line throughout this session of how these environmental factors do influence health differently across different communities. And as we think about environmental sociology and how that interacts with medical sociology. So we're going to be talking about some key things like environmental justice, exposure pathways, cumulative risk, these things that are throughout the reading. So you can find in the notes these key summaries of the readings as usual. And let's dive in right into the first reading. So the Hakeem reading at Hamburger Central, Antibiotics for Cattle That Aren't Sick. So this article is a really interesting one. Hakeem here is exploring the widespread use of antibiotics in cattle farming. So the things, how we get beef, right? How we get dairy, all that sort of stuff. And particularly focusing on the practice of administering antibiotics to healthy animals in order to promote growth or prevent disease in a crowded industrial farming environment. So this practice of this, providing antibiotics, giving antibiotics to healthy animals, this practice, as the authors show, has serious public health implications due to its contribution to the, antibiotic resistance in society, which not only affects the health of the animals, but also poses a growing risk to actual human health as we consume these animal products. So this article critiques the prioritization of productivity over the long-term health consequences of these practices. So if you heard about antibiotic resistance, it's that in society, this is growing more and more, that we are increasingly resistant to our historical and normal use of antibiotics, that we need to use more antibiotics, that we need stronger antibiotics, that the typical use of antibiotics are getting less and less effective in human populations because we are more resistant to antibiotics. And this could be a key, as the authors talk about, this use of antibiotics really widespread in animals that we consume and consume their animal products, even when they're healthy, may be contributing to this. So a couple notes here. Number one, on the industrial agricultural practices and public health, on what are the impacts here. So industrial agriculture often emphasizes efficiency and cost effectiveness. Those are really, because it's a business, right? So efficiency and cost effectiveness, but sometimes doing these things at the expense of human health and animal welfare. So for example, in intensive farming operations, antibiotics are frequently used to prevent disease in crowded conditions, right? You see those packed groups of cattle, for instance, or even to promote faster growth, despite these animals not showing actual symptoms of illness. So this subtherapeutic therapeutic use, we call it, where they're not actually symptomatic or sick. This subtherapeutic use of antibiotics helps to produce more meat at a lower cost, but also has the unintended public health consequences that they talk about in this reading. And one of those things is antibiotic resistance in humans. So the use of antibiotics in livestock can result in the development of antibiotic resistant bacteria. And these bacteria can spread to humans through consumption of contaminated meat or through environmental exposure, such as runoff from farms. And antibiotic resistant infections are a lot harder to treat, obviously. And so these lead to longer hospitalizations, higher healthcare costs, and in some cases, even death because of these antibiotic resistant infections. And so in particular, this overuse of antibiotics in agriculture contributes to the development of these things we call superbugs that no longer respond to conventional antibiotics and conventional means of treatment. And part of the reason for that is because of this hugely widespread subtherapeutic use of antibiotics in cattle and livestock. And so this produces a chain reaction. Livestock antibiotic use being one, right? Livestock antibiotic use. Step 2, antibiotic resistance in animals occurring. Step 3, antibiotic resistance in humans occurring, and then finally leading to public health risks. So connecting the dots there between livestock antibiotic use with a widespread and overuse to public health risks. So industrial agricultural practices here are linked to those wider public health risks, where that overuse of antibiotics can result in the mutation of bacteria into resistant strains that are a lot harder to treat with existing drugs. And again, those things lead to, like what I just mentioned, of longer hospitalizations, higher healthcare costs, and even worse healthcare, health-related outcomes in our human population. So we have to think about how the effects of what we're producing, how we're producing cattle and livestock-related resources, and using those subtherapeutic uses of antibiotics, how that can actually and do lead to public health risks as well. So let's talk a little bit more about this reading here. So a couple other key things that the author is discussing, that Hakim is discussing here. One, about vulnerable populations. So certain populations are more vulnerable to the consequences of antibiotic resistance due to factors like limited healthcare access, weakened immune systems, or pre-existing conditions. So, for example, elderly individuals and those with chronic diseases could be considered part of these vulnerable populations. Even low-income populations may face greater exposure to antibiotic resistance bacteria because they might rely more heavily on lower cost meats, which are more likely to come from industrial farms that use those antibiotics in their animals. So again, thinking about the connection of socioeconomic status and health there, folks that need those lower cost meats those are often those that are using more proactively and more often those antibiotics. And two, the socioeconomic factors and health disparities. So we've talked about at length the effects of socioeconomic status on an individual and how it correlates with health risks. Well, it also correlates with exposure to these risks that we're talking about today, these specific risks, so that people in low-income communities might have less access to healthy food options and may be more likely to consume meat from industrial farms. So those without adequate healthcare access may not receive the necessary treatment when they contract antibiotic-resistant infections. So all that does is just exacerbates health disparities. So again, seeing the link here, as we're talking about these antibiotic-resistant strains, that there still is a disparity with folks in lower socioeconomic status, low population communities, or low income communities, and how they are experiencing this exposure and these risks at greater degrees. So that disparity still exists there. That's another example of a socioeconomic status related disparity in health outcomes. So says kind of a wrap up on this article is that this article really serves as a great starting point for discussing and thinking about how environmental exposures like antibiotic resistant bacteria can be linked to broader public health concerns. So health disparities are worsened, as we've talked about, by both socioeconomic factors and policy choices that shape food production and shape food distribution systems, and that addressing these issues requires, again, a more downstream approach, but also a multifaceted approach, including better regulation of agricultural practices, increased transparency, and expanded access to healthcare for those most vulnerable to these risks. So again, think about all those connections, right? All those connections of socioeconomic status, but think about even just how our food production is an element of exposure and environmental disparities for our health. The second reading that was on deck for us today was the Martuzzi et al. Reading from 2010, talking about inequalities, inequities, and environmental justice in waste management health. So taking a little bit different approach to the exposure than the previous the reading based upon livestock and food production there. So this reading explores the health impacts of waste management practices and how marginalized communities bear a disproportionate burden of environmental health risks. So the authors here are emphasizing that inequalities in waste management, so think about garbage pickup, recycling, that sort of thing, that inequalities here, like the placement of waste facilities in certain neighborhoods, that sort of thing, contributes to environmental injustice. So these practices not only create health disparities, but also highlight how society's structural inequalities, such as race, income, political power, these things affect who is most exposed to harmful environmental risks. So a couple of key points that the authors discuss here. Number one, the distinction between inequality and inequity. This is really important to set a foundation as we understand things just in general sociology, but also, of course, how we're understanding inequalities and inequities in health related outcomes. So starting with inequality. Inequality refers to the uneven distribution of resources and outcomes, such as unequal distribution of wealth and healthcare and education across a specific social group. So maybe based on race or gender or class, whatever that might be. So for example, one community might have access to better healthcare and clean air and quality schools, while another does not, leading to unequal outcomes in health and well-being. So that's inequality. Inequity, on the other hand, refers to unfairness or unjustness in the distribution of these resources or risks. So in the context of environmental health, inequities occur when vulnerable populations, such as low-income or racial minority communities, are disproportionately exposed to harmful waste management practices or environmental hazards. So for example, waste facilities are more likely to be located in areas inhabited by marginalized populations, thus creating an unjust exposure to health risk. So again, inequality, think about the uneven distribution of resources. Inequity, the unfairness or injustice of the methods of distribution themselves. So again, thinking about both, inequity often leads to inequality, right? The inequity of the unfairness of how these resources and the methods of these resources are distributed oftentimes results in an unequal distribution of those resources themselves. So the equity component is often foundational to addressing issues of inequality. So waste management and health is the second key point I want to mention here, is that the article here outlines how waste management practices. So think about things like landfills, incinerations, and toxic waste disposals. These things can negatively impact human health. So in particular, poor air quality, water contamination, and soil degradation from waste facilities have significant health consequences. And exposure to hazardous waste and chemicals and pollutants, these things can lead to respiratory issues, cases of cancer, birth defects, and other health problems as well, particularly for those living in proximity to waste sites. And that's really important to know, because who's living in those, more often living in proximity to those waste sites? People of lower income communities, marginalized communities, people from racial minority communities. So again, thinking about environmental justice here, that it's the inequity and inequality here, that we have to address those downstream effects again, and looking at how these things, waste management and health impacts I just mentioned, are unequally, are disproportionately impacting those lower socioeconomic status, those folks from marginalized communities more, because just based upon environmental exposure. And then that third piece there, disproportionate burden on marginalized communities. So here the authors are talking about how low-income communities and racial minorities often face higher exposure to environmental hazards. So they're more likely to live near toxic waste facilities, for example. And this is a result of historical practices such as redlining. And if you don't know what redlining is a discriminatory practice that denied services or investments, especially in terms of housing, to people based on their race and ethnicity. So it limited where people of racial minorities in the United States, for example, could live, could get loans. We're allowed to actually develop and live and have housing. So again, these historical practices such as redlining, dictating where people could live, still to this day, we see those impacts, especially as we see environmental exposure to hazardous areas and hazardous materials. And so, and that, as well as environmental racism, where communities of color are systematically targeted for the placement of dangerous waste management facilities. These things are continuing to happen, and these things continue to have really important impacts on minority populations and low-income populations' health outcomes as a collective group. So that's, again, thinking about this population health perspective of how do we address specific groups' healthcare outcomes? How do we better those healthcare outcomes? Well, it comes down to, these are key factors to look at of the historical impacts and the contemporary impacts of redlining and environmental racism that we're seeing to this day and environment exposure is a key critical component of that. So let's continue on a little bit more with this reading. The article presented a couple of different case studies. So case study 1, waste sites in low-income urban areas. So the article presents a case study of low-income urban areas where waste management sites, including landfills and incinerators, are concentrated. And then residents in these areas often suffer from increased health risks, including respiratory diseases, heart disease, and cancer. So these neighborhoods, frequently composed of racial minorities, bear the brunt of hazardous waste exposure due to a lack of political power to resist the siting of these facilities in those more higher income, predominantly white communities. And then a second case study, the authors present in the article about these rural areas and hazardous waste disposal. So another case study that focused on rural, marginalized communities where the disposal of industrial waste is often outsourced to economically vulnerable regions. So these areas might not have the infrastructure or the resources to address the health implications of waste exposure. And that what that does is it leaves residents vulnerable to more long-term health risks. So these couple of case studies that I wanted to highlight, them because, number one, they help to solidify a lot of the key concepts that the article's talking about. It helps to exemplify them and talk through them. But two, identifying how these issues of environmental injustice and exposure issues are related to public health outcomes. They're present in both urban and rural communities, and they present in more nuanced ways across them. But it's important to note that this is not just an urban or not just a rural issue, that these issues are present across these different types of communities. So a couple of big takeaways again here from the reading here, just to give a nice to bow and conclusion here. Number one, environmental inequality and injustice. So environmental inequality is visible in the way waste management and exposure to environmental hazards are distributed unequally across different socioeconomic and racial groups. And inequities, remember the difference between inequality and inequities. Inequities exist when this uneven distribution is also unfair, resulting in a disproportionate burden on marginalized groups. That inequality is more centralized on, say, groups of lower income population, socioeconomic status, racial minorities, etc. The second key takeaway there, environmental health and social determinants. So health outcomes are not just influenced by biological factors. That's such a critical foundational component of this class, right? But also by those social determinants like we've talked about, socioeconomic status, race, and access to political power. Discriminatory practices like those we've talked about throughout this reading, environmental racism and a lack of healthcare access, these things contribute to poor health outcomes for those living in vulnerable communities. So again, just wanting to emphasize those social determinants more and more because that is a critical takeaway. And then finally, policy solutions. So addressing these inequalities and these inequities requires a more comprehensive approach that includes policy reforms to regulate waste management, increase community involvement in decision-making, and ensure that environmental justice is a key focus in public health initiatives. It's also essential for policies to consider socioeconomic and racial factors when developing strategies for waste management, environmental health. I'd be curious in some maybe your discussion prompts for the week talking about policy solutions, because we've talked about upstream versus downstream efforts and the need for those downstream efforts. But oftentimes, when I'm talking with students, when we think of public health, oftentimes we're leaving out the environmental component. That's why we're centering on this today, because that environmental justice, exposure, these things are really critical impacts for our collective public health outcomes that we need to address them. But then we also need to address these things from a downstream sociological perspective, that we're looking at socioeconomic barriers and racial factors as well, that it's not just a one-size-fits-all solution, that we need that community involvement decision-making, that again, the initiatives that we are implementing in our communities, we have those community inputs. So we need minority voice input when it comes to our community public health initiatives and environmental initiatives that contribute directly to our public health. So really a couple of really interesting readings where you see a couple of different types of when we talk about exposure in public health, whether it's the livestock component or whether it's hazardous and waste management issues. So these are really, really important components. And there were also a couple of videos for the day as well that I thought were very, very interesting. Starting with the PBS Frontline, the Plastic Wars documentary. So this documentary reveals the strategies of like the plastics industry, right? To shift public focus away from the production issues and onto recycling and examining the health and environmental consequences of this. So I really thought this documentary does a great job in providing a critical lens on the environmental and health impacts of plastic production, of plastic waste and pollution. And it delves into the plastic industry's strategies to deflect attention from the overproduction of plastics by promoting recycling as this wonderful, wonderful, amazing solution. However, the reality is that most plastics are not recycled effectively, and this leads to widespread environmental degradation and significant health risks. And these effects disproportionately, again, a theme throughout the course, disproportionately impact low-income communities and communities of color, again, demonstrating that clear link between environmental exposure and socioeconomic status and health disparities. So expanding on the documentary a little bit, and there are these 5 key areas I just wanted to highlight. So number one, the recycling myth versus reality. So the documentary reveals how corporate narratives about recycling, what they do is they perpetuate a misleading belief that individual consumer action can purely solve the plastic pollution crisis. So this deflection obscures the larger issue of overproduction by these corporations. So from a medical sociology perspective, this highlights that structural factors that shape environmental health risks, right? These things are critical for our focus. And it's not just individual choices, but systemic issues such as corporate practices and weak regulations that perpetuate plastic-related environmental harm. You see the interesting impact of all this, right? I'm sure we all learned about the great need for recycling in elementary school and middle school and high school. And that's very much the case. But we know that plastic recycling is very much over relied upon. And there's a lot of myths revolving it, that glass recycling is far more effective, but plastic production is very effective for these companies. And so they perpetuated a lot of these mischaracterized myths about what about our impacts as individual consumers on recycling plastics, taking the burden essentially off of these corporations. Number 2, health consequences of plastic exposure. So plastics release toxic chemicals during their actual production and their use and disposal. So these include substances like dioxins, various sort of substances that they talk about in the actual documentary. And these substances are linked to chronic diseases, endocrine disruptions, and reproductive health problems. And medical sociologists examine how social determinants of health, including environmental conditions, create and exacerbate these health risks. And this connects directly to discussions of environmental exposure as a key pathway in linking socioeconomic status to health disparities. Number 3 there, environmental justice and health inequities. So communities near plastic production facilities and waste disposal sites, more often than not low income and communities of color, face disproportionately high exposure to toxic chemicals. So this is an example of environmental racism, where marginalized groups are burdened with greater environmental health risks due to that systemic inequalities component here. And then medical sociologists, again, we study these disparities to understand how race and how class and how geography, these things intersect to create uneven health outcomes. So for instance, limited access to legal and political resources makes it harder for these communities to advocate for cleaner environments or hold corporations accountable. 4, stress and psychological effects. The constant exposure to these toxins, coupled with limited exposure over environmental conditions, contributes to chronic stress. Remember, we've talked about chronic stress, and that's a significant determinant of both physical and mental health. Again, chronic stress, of how these conditions and stressors just build up more and more over time, just a building and cumulative component. So this aligns with broader discussions in medical sociology as well about how social stressors stemming from environmental inequalities can worsen health outcomes, particularly for those more vulnerable populations. And then 5, global context and policy implications. So plastic pollution is not just a national United States issue or Western issue, it's a global issue. Its effects still, though, are felt most significantly and acutely at the local level, particularly in economically disadvantaged regions. So addressing these inequities requires international cooperation, stronger environmental regulations, and a shift in corporate accountability. So it's an interesting dynamic here where it is a global issue, but our smaller, more local communities are who are feeling the impacts most predominantly. And so medical sociology encourages a focus on policy interventions that prioritize health equity and environmental sustainability, particularly for communities that bear the greatest burden of industrial pollution, those marginalized, oftentimes racial minority and low socioeconomic status, low income communities. Just a couple of key takeaways from the reading again. I just want to summarize it a bit further. Number 1, structural versus individual responsibility. So the plastic pollution crisis highlights that the limitations of individual actions in addressing systemic environmental issues, right? We talked about that in the myth of pollution, essentially, or the myth of recycling plastics. Health outcomes tied to plastic exposure are deeply rooted in corporate practices and weak regulations and social inequalities. And so number 2, environmental health disparities. Communities near those plastic production and waste disposal facilities face disproportionate health risks, illustrating further that intersection between socioeconomic status, race, and health inequities. And these risks extend beyond physical health, contributing to psychological stress, psychosocial stress, chronic stress, and reduced quality of life. Number 3, the role of policy and advocacy. So addressing these issues, because we don't just want to talk about them, but let's actually figure out how to address them. Addressing these issues, like so many others, requires systemic change through corporate accountability, environmental justice initiatives, and policy reforms that promote the health of vulnerable populations. Again, thinking about those downstream root causes approaches. And then finally, number 4, the medical sociology perspective. This documentary serves as a great case study in how social structures and power dynamics influence environmental exposure and health outcomes. And that aligns with the broader themes that we've been talking about in class and the broader themes of medical sociology. So it helps to reinforce that those downstream efforts, understanding the health impacts of specific populations, specific groups, and looking at what are the root causes, that's how we need to address these things, including the root causes of environmental factors and exposure. All right. The last thing that I want to talk about is this second video here. We talked about, it's called Toxic Air in Steam Valley. So it's this Vice Chronic special. So the video here, this emphasizes how emissions from industrial activities create severe air quality issues that affect residents in rural areas. So the documentary, I think, provides a really compelling case study of how industrial activities severely impact air quality in rural communities. Again, thinking about rural versus urban, leading to significant health consequences. So the video illustrates the intersection of socioeconomic status and geography and environmental exposure with a really keen focus on underserved areas where residents face disproportionate risk. And thinking about the inequality and equity issues. So these risks include things like chronic respiratory conditions and other diseases directly linked to poor health quality. And they're compounded by a lack of resources and advocacy to address these challenges. So some key themes that I want to highlight from the video as well. The video highlights, number 1, industrial emissions and environmental exposure. So the video highlights how emissions from factories and industrial plants contribute to air pollution, which I'm sure we all understand what that is, right? Air pollution, releasing harmful particulates and harmful toxins into the environment. And these pollutants lead to respiratory issues such as asthma, COPD, and increased risks for cardiovascular diseases. So from a medical sociology perspective, And this connects to the concept of environmental health disparities, right? The things that we talk about throughout this entire session, where proximity to these industrial sites correlates with higher exposure to harmful substances, disproportionately affecting these more marginalized and low-income communities. Number two, socioeconomic vulnerability. So rural communities with lower socioeconomic status often lack the political power and resources to advocate for cleaner air or hold industries accountable, and limited economic opportunities can force these residents to live near polluting industries or work in hazardous environments that further just increases their exposure and then further increases their poor health related outcomes. So medical sociology examines these systemic inequalities, demonstrating how socioeconomic status influences environmental vulnerability, we call it, and contributes to unequal health outcomes. Number three, in health outcomes and chronic diseases. So poor air quality has direct links to respiratory diseases and long-term health issues, particularly in children and the elderly who are more vulnerable to those types of air pollutants. So chronic stress as well from living in polluted environments further exacerbates health problems, aligning with research in medical sociology on how social stressors contribute to both physical and mental health disparities. Number four, environmental racism and advocacy gaps. So while the documentary focuses on rural areas, these issues are often compounded for communities of color in urban settings as well, demonstrating patterns of environmental racism across these different types of communities. So the lack of strong advocacy in these underserved areas reflects broader systemic inequalities at work. So communities with fewer resources often face higher barriers to political action or and legal recourse, perpetuating these cycles of neglect and harm. Again, think about this as a cyclical nature, that how do you impact, how do you actually make a change in this type of thing? And that leads to number five, systemic versus individual solutions. So the documentary underscores the need for systemic interventions, including stricter regulations on emissions, and investment in clean energy and policies prioritizing environmental justice. So medical sociology emphasizes that health outcomes are not solely the result of these individual choices, but rather are deeply shaped by systemic and structural factors, including toxins and pollutants in our air and environmental exposure, depending on where we live and when we can afford to live. Finally, just a couple of quick components here as well, key takeaways from the video. So again, just linking environmental exposure to these broader discussions about socioeconomic health and or socioeconomic status and health disparities. Key takeaways though, before kind of summarizing this video takeaways. So environmental health disparities. Again, the video highlights how rural, low socioeconomic status communities are disproportionately affected by industrial air pollution, and that these disparities are driven by systemic inequalities that leave these communities vulnerable to environmental health risks. Number two, the intersection of socioeconomic status, geography, and health. So health outcomes are shaped by environmental exposure, and this exposure is often tied to socioeconomic and geographic factors. Residents in these areas face not only direct health risks, but also indirect, things like chronic health or chronic stress of living in these hazardous environments. Number three, needs for systemic change, a common theme throughout this course and throughout this today, that addressing these issues requires systemic solutions, including stricter environmental regulations, investment in clean technologies, and policies that prioritize health equity and environmental justice. Finally, number four, a medical sociology perspective. So this case study, this video reinforces the importance of viewing health through a sociological lens, right? That's why we're here in this class. So it illustrates how structural factors such as socioeconomic status and environmental policies intersect to create unequal and inequitable health outcomes, aligning with broader themes throughout this course and throughout medical sociology in general. Finally, just a quick wrap up for the entire day. Just some key findings from this day and from this session. I just want to reinforce it's so important to understand these things and encourage you all to think about how you would apply this sort of knowledge to those policy suggestions, how you'd address these issues with broader implications, and then environmental exposure. Some key findings here: environmental exposure, again, things like waste management, industrial practices, air pollution, those sorts of things. Environmental exposure is not only a significant determinant of health, but also one that is often shaped by policy and socioeconomic inequities. And so marginalized communities, especially those low income and racial minority groups, are disproportionately affected by toxic waste exposure, by pollution, and poor waste management practices. And all these things contribute to health disparities based upon these issues and these differences. And that these environmental injustices are perpetuated by broader structural inequalities and can be exacerbated by the lack of access to resources or political influence to actually mitigate these risks, highlighting the role for systemic change and the need for stronger advocacy and resources. So just to connect some content here again, some shared themes throughout this course that we shared with today. Just to emphasize these shared themes quick, environmental injustice as number one. You see it on the slide there. This is referring to the unequal exposure to environmental hazards based on race and socioeconomic status. Number two, structural determinants. So policies and practices such as zoning and waste facility siting and lack of health infrastructure, these things create and perpetuate health disparities. And then finally, health equity. So achieving equitable health outcomes by addressing both environmental and social determinants of health, that is the goal of health equity. So be thinking about all these things and how we can be solution-based by understanding all of these issues. Okay, so that's what I want you to be summarizing today and be kind of the big takeaway of how do we think of environment and exposure and those sorts of things as so linked to health and as a part of our public and population health initiatives, as potential practitioners and experts someday, that we need to take into consideration these things and think from a policy standpoint, the need for greater advocacy and resources, the need for those downstream approaches to address root causes like these. These are critical components to medical sociology. So that was our session today on environment exposure and health disparities. So please let me know of any questions you have. I'm very, very curious to see all of your discussion prompts for this week. But if you want to meet one-on-one, as always, more than happy to do that. But please let me know of any questions you have, and we will see you next time.